Good morning, everybody. It's very good to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak. And I'm delighted to be here with our partners, the Korea Press Foundation. At the Reuters Institute, we have strong links with Korea. And in recent years, we've had many talented journalists come to us from Korea to join our fellowship program in Oxford. Recently, they've been broadcast journalists. We haven't had many from the press, but we hope that may change in future. What I'm going to do today is draw on some of our key findings from our digital news report, which has been running since 2012 and which is led by my colleague Nick Newman. And I'm going to talk about that with a specific focus on the issue of trust. So, as some of you may know, this is the biggest ongoing survey of news in the world, a comparative survey of news in the world. Covers about 70,000 respondents across 36 countries, including South Korea. And some of you will have seen the Korean edition of the Digital News Report, which was on our seats yesterday. So here's a list of the countries that we cover. We do this through an online poll. So it's representative of people who are online, but not necessarily of national populations. So it would tend to underrepresent traditional media behavior when we talk about cross-platform behavior. But it's a very good guide, particularly to what people are doing in terms of consuming news online. This thing seems to be moving at its own pace. So there's a survey, we have about 2,000 people per country, and at the bottom here you can see a list of the sponsors of the study. They include the Korea Press Foundation, Google, the BBC, regulators, including Ofcom in the UK and its Irish equivalent, and a number of universities. So just moving on to the summary points that I'm going to talk about today. First point really is confidence in the news is quite low. Digital media is a factor in that, but I'll also talk about the issue of political polarization. The second point is that there's mixed signals really about whether the debate on fake news makes journalism more valuable or not. Social media remains critical for news, but we've seen a shift to more private messaging apps. And social and search are exposing people to more sources of news, but there's an issue around brand recognition. And there's some interesting prospects for pay, which I'll talk about in a while. So moving on, in the era of fake news, we asked people, how much do you think social media does a good job at helping people distinguish fact from fiction? And we see here the figure that only about 24% agree that social media does a good job in doing this. Some people say it's a petri dish for all kinds of different viewpoints, or people share without reading the information in the article. When you turn to the news media itself, the figure is rather better. 40% of people think the news media does a good job in separating fact from fiction, and they see that this is partly because some of the core values of the news media, it's their job to report the facts, but people are not uncritical either. So they tend to sort of triangulate between different sources, and 40%, as I say, much better than the figure for social media, but it's not exactly an overwhelming endorsement. So there's some high-level figures about trust. I want to move on to talk about the issue of trust and polarization. And you saw this slide yesterday afternoon. This is the percentage of people who agree that they trust media most of the time across our 36 countries, where we see the Nordic countries and some others. On the left, Finland has the highest level of trust. Korea has the lowest level of trust on the right. I think one needs to be a little bit cautious when you look at this slide, because of course we ask everybody in each individual country, do you trust the media most of the time? And of course, that's a question for each country, and most people can only answer for their own country. So there's a hierarchy here, if you like, between countries, but it's slightly artificial because people in Korea don't know how their trust compares to trust of people in Finland. They're just answering for their country. Nevertheless, this is the second year running, as we heard yesterday indeed, that the figure for Korea is pretty low. There's a few points I'd pick out here. One is that what's happening in the UK, which is the figure in the UK has declined in terms of general trust in the media most of the time, 7 percentage points down in this year compared to last year. We think that may be partly due to the political polarization after the Brexit referendum in June last year. And in the US, we see 38% trust news in general, most media, most of the time, but there's a much higher level of people who trust the sources they use. And that's a pretty good, that difference between those two figures is a pretty good indication of a polarized media environment. So people, if they use the New York Times, the Washington Post, or Fox News, they will have a high level of trust in that, but if they, but they don't have a very high level of trust in media in general. I wanted to talk a little bit about, we published an Asia-Pacific report earlier this month, and I've just sort of pulled out the figures from what it looks like in Asia-Pacific with the US and the UK on the right there. And the figures that you see here is that the average across all our countries of trust in media most of the time is about 43%. Most of the countries in this region are about that level, but Taiwan, Malaysia, and South Korea are lower. Just looking at what happens by age, generally the picture across all our countries is that young people are less likely to have trust in the media. And I just pulled out some figures here for Asia-Pacific countries about how this varies. And we're looking here at 3 age groups, 18 to 29, 30 to 45, and 46 and above. And what you can see is for all the countries here, there's a difference. The youngest group, the 18 to 29-year-olds, have less trust in the media in general than the older ones. But if you look at South Korea, the difference between the youngest group and the oldest group here, the 46 and over, is quite dramatic. You remember I said that the level of trust in South Korea, the overall level of trust I gave in news most of the time was 23%. Here, when you break it down by age, see the figure of 13% for the youngest group, which is a very low level of trust indeed, and is less than half the figure for the eldest group. So, I mean, I'm not going to speculate on the reasons for that. There's many, many people in the room who are much better equipped to do that than me, but I think in this general tendency where young people's level of trust is lower, that phenomenon seems particularly polarized and particularly acute here in Korea. So one of the issues that affects trust is the issue of political polarization. And I'm just going to talk you through a bit of work that we've done here, where we looked at the audience and polarization across a map here, and this is a map of audience, how the audience's preferences vary. We asked people at the beginning of our survey, would you define yourself as being on the left or on the right? So this is how the audience defined themselves in the survey. And what we've done is we've mapped the preferences of people, the news sources they use, according to where they sit on the political map. And what you see here in the US is that there's a group of media that seem to serve people on the left rather well, that large group of bubbles. The size of the bubble here is the size of the audience for each media. And this is what some people in the US call the so-called liberal media. And there is indeed a cluster of people there on the left, of news organizations on the left, which are serving people with left-to-center positions quite well, ranging from the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, etc. Yahoo occupies a midpoint, and Fox News is on the right. I suppose what's interesting is that when you look on the right, there's not a lot of supply on the right in the US spectrum. There's Fox News, and Breitbart has come on board recently, and on the left, Occupy Democrats. And this leads to some comments of this kind that we heard in the open-ended responses that people gave us. Fox News keeps it fair. CNN tells us left-wing lies was one. Another one was CNN, this is so far to the left they might fall off. And the last point really, and this is the fundamental point, is in the US, people on the political right almost 3 times as likely to distrust the news media as people on the left. So this is a highly polarized political environment and a highly polarized media environment. I'm going to talk through 2 more countries to try and look at this spread of polarization and how this is reflected in news consumption across 2 more countries. Firstly, turning to the UK. So here we have a spread, if you like. I'm just going to go back here. In the UK, we've got a range of news organizations clustered around the middle here, a slightly wider range than the US. The very large bubble in the middle there is the BBC, just to the left of the middle there. You've got The Guardian and other people. These are online brands only I'm talking about here, not print, on the left. But you've got a rather more heavily populated topography on the right there, if you like, with the large bubble in the centre right being the Daily Mail, the Mail Online, and a cluster of other newspapers. It's an interesting, and then on the far right there's Breitbart, and on the left there's the Canary, which is a left-wing supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, currently the leader of the Labour Party. These are rather small brands, but they've popped up in the areas that are where there's an opportunity, if you like, on the far left and the far right of this spectrum. There's a real challenge for the BBC here in the middle. The BBC is doing a good job in a way. It's marshalling together a very large audience. That was the audience that was, if you like, represented by Yahoo News in the US. But being in the centre is not an easy place to be in a polarising media environment. And here's a couple of comments, really, and this is largely in the wake of the Brexit referendum in the UK. Here's one comment. I used to trust and value BBC News, but now it's a mouthpiece for liberal leftists, was one. And at the bottom left, even the BBC tends to support a far right-wing party nowadays. They're talking about the BBC exercising what the BBC would see as its obligation to be duly impartial on the issue of the UK leaving the European Union. So that's the UK environment, an environment where you have a rather broader range of media organizations serving the range of the political views that are there, the wider range of the political spectrum, with the BBC as a very, very large organization in the middle, trying to hold together some common facts in a polarizing media environment. It's 70% of people use the BBC every week, so it's doing quite well, but it's highly contested. Just looking at Germany, a less polarized environment. So what we see in Germany is we see a group of media organizations basically all on the center left or the center right, so a much narrower range of views there. But what we see as well is that this, with some of the public broadcasters on the left and ARD and other ones on the left, and a range on the center right, but a pretty narrow range of views. And no real online news organizations that we detected this year using on the far right or the far left. Pretty kind of closely clustered group. And that may be, you may think that's good or you may think it's bad. I suppose one of the side effects of that is that some people see that this is a rather narrow range of views that are expressed in the media, and you see these 2 comments by people. I don't always trust the media, especially in matters relating to the refugee crisis, or there's a lot that's hushed up in the media. So it leads to a sense that you have a narrow range of views expressed in the media, but some people feeling that their views are excluded, or people that think like them will never get a voice in the media. So I think there's no right or wrong in this kind of media mapping that we've got. We're just trying to describe the situation as we find it, but I think each of these different maps that I've shown here, the US, the UK, and Germany, show different issues that can arise in terms of the range of views that are expressed across the media and what the media landscape looks like. As I said, these maps are just looking at news online. So I talked about trust in the media. I want to talk about the other issue, which is what I call news avoidance, and also reflect a little bit on fake news. So firstly, our survey only includes people who use news regularly online. So when we're talking about news avoidance, we're talking about avoidance by people who are regular users of news. And we ask them the question, the question that we're looking at is, do you sometimes or often avoid the news? And I've just shown you here the figures for this region. And if you look at the bottom with the comparison of the US and the UK at the bottom, and if you look at what's happening here in the UK, 25% of people sometimes or often avoid the news. In the US, 39%. If you look up the range of countries we've looked at here in this Asia-Pacific report we did recently, the one that stands out is Japan. Only 6% of people in Japan sometimes or often avoid the news. Korea, 26%, pretty much in line with the figure across many of our countries. Malaysia is the other standout. 40% of people sometimes or often avoid the news. So the question, I suppose, is why might people avoid the news? And we tried to look at that in a little bit of detail. And we tried to map that across all our countries, all 36 countries. And we sort of broke out the answers here, and you can see them. On the left, the largest single answer was, the news can often have a negative effect on my mood. The second one, and this relates to questions about trust and fake news, I can't rely on news to be true. And then you can see the other answers there. I don't feel there's anything I can do. Graphic images upset me. It leads to arguments I'd rather avoid. These things play out differently in different countries as to whether they're about trust, mood, arguments. The last one, of course, is going to be worse, I guess, in very polarized political societies, leading to arguments I'd rather avoid. So these are the way the answers for news avoiders break out across all our countries. We've looked at this in a little bit more detail in the US, where we've looked at this by political orientation. And what's quite interesting here, if you look at this slide, is that this is just the US, and this is just reasons for avoiding the news. On the left-hand side of the slide, the blue bar is people who identify themselves on the left. The light blue bar is people who identify themselves as on the right politically. And what you see is people on the left in the US, they're the largest number of people who say looking at the news can have a negative effect on my mood. The people on the right, the light blue bar, there on the right, the largest number there is the people who are saying I can't rely on news to be true. So you see a very different kind of environment there between left and right as to why people might avoid the news. Whether it affects their mood, presumably because they don't like what they're hearing about in the news, or whether they can't rely on it to be true. So I'm just going to move on to look at the question about what might news avoidance do. I suppose it's understandable why some people might avoid the news, but there's obviously a consequence of this. And in the UK, we had our referendum on the UK leaving the European Union, and the day after the referendum, the most sought-after term on Google News, or the second most top question in the UK on Google was, what does it mean to leave the EU? What is the EU? Which countries are in the EU? What will happen now we've left the EU? How many countries are in the EU? Arguably, these are things that people might have been better placed to know about before they voted, rather than the day after they voted. So, news avoidance, understandable, but with what consequences in terms of public information, I guess. So just moving on to look at the question of fake news. We did some focus groups this year to try and understand how audiences understood fake news, what they mean by it. It's obviously a term that's been thrown around a lot and weaponized by some in the political arena. And we found, through talking to focus groups, that there's lots of different forms of fake news, and people distinguish between them. There's fabricated news, that's stories made up for money or propaganda. That's the famous Macedonian teenager, or maybe the Russian bots. There's poor journalism, that's our responsibility as journalists. That's mistakes, exaggeration, clickbait, things that are seen as journalistic faults, but they are journalism, but it's not very good journalism. Propaganda, this can include partisan journalism, journalism that's skewed or that pursues a political agenda, and some aspects of journalism that use on manipulating advertising revenues, whether it's in terms of the kinds of things that you see at the bottom of some newspapers' pages or whatever. These things don't induce trust amongst audiences. The last category is not really seen as journalism at all, and it's not fake news. It's neither seen as journalism nor fake news. And fortunately, in a way, people recognize parody and satire generally for what it is and what it's meant to be, and they don't categorize that as news. They see that as something else. So when people talk about fake news or the term is weaponized, one needs to sort of work out where the responsibility, what it means, and where the responsibility, if any, lies for that. And this was an attempt by us through using a series of focus groups to try and work that out a little bit more and understand a little bit more about what was going on with that. I guess in response to this, people have different ways they can respond. And the focus groups we did in the US basically showed two different responses to worries about news and fake news. The first, preferred by older people, I guess, was stick to the reputable news brands. Go to the trusted brands. Cross-check the other things you hear against the trusted news sources. The other one, a rather different one, seeking alternative sources. If you like, trust nobody. Triangulate everything you hear. Check it on social media. Research everything. Google it, and so on. So these are two very different approaches to low trust in the news. I suppose the first one is reassuring if you're an established news organization. The second one is a rather more testing one. And as I said, this is based on focus group research we did amongst news avoiders in the US. I want to move on and talk a little bit about what's happening in social media in the last couple of years and how that's changing. So I think one of the most interesting things we've found in the last year is the changing face of social media. On the surface, things we see here, across all the 36 countries we looked at, there's an average of about 54% who use social media for news across all those countries. If you look at the US and the UK here, you can see the figures there for yourself, but you can also see that the figures have doubled pretty much since we started tracking this in a consistent way in about 2013. So there's many more people using social media for news over the years. But in some countries, the number of people using social media for news seems to be slacking off. So here's just a few countries I've taken from Europe here, where the figure in Spain, 51%, as I said, compared to 54% across all our countries, France, Germany, and some other countries there in Europe. But in all those countries, you see a slight slacking off in use of social media for news this year. Now, this could be disillusion setting in, could be changes to the algorithm, and Facebook in particular, that prioritize friends and family over professional content, or it could be the rise of closed messaging apps. It's hard to be sure what the cause of this is, and it may be a mix of all of those things. But if we look a little bit of detail at what are the networks people are using for social media, there's some interesting things that emerge. So firstly, on the left, this is looking across all our 36 countries that we're covering. The dark blue bar is the use of Facebook or one of these other networks for any purpose in the last week. The light blue bar is the use of this network for news. And you see across all our countries, 47% of people used Facebook for news in the last week, 22% YouTube, 6% Instagram, 10% Twitter, and 3% LinkedIn. So Facebook here, still very, very dominant across all our countries. Not here in Korea, but across the 36 countries, a pretty dominant social network. But some suggestions, as I've said, that there may be some slacking off in that. And what we see on the messaging side is that we see, looking at WhatsApp, 40% of people across our countries are using WhatsApp for some form in the last week, 15% for news, the light blue bar, 8% Facebook Messenger, 2% Snapchat, 1% WeChat. Now, it's worth remembering that Facebook owns WhatsApp as well as Instagram, so around 80% of people use a Facebook product weekly for any purpose across all our countries, and 23% of people use messaging apps for news weekly. Messaging apps, we heard a bit about this yesterday. Messaging apps are changing quite a lot around the world and becoming much more widely used. And this is just us trying to track some of these messaging apps in some of the countries that I've just mentioned. And we heard yesterday about Kakao Talk, and you can see here South Korea, we had our figure 39% of people using that every week. And on the left, you see WhatsApp being particularly popular in Malaysia. There's a lot of speculation as to what's going on with messaging apps and different reasons for using messaging apps. There are some countries, it's by no means the case for all of them, but there are some countries where people will prefer a messaging app. A country like Turkey, say, which we haven't listed here, people would prefer using a messaging app like WhatsApp to exchange their views on news in a pretty closed political environment where there may be some price for expressing your political views openly than doing it openly on Facebook. So one of the issues about social media is whether social media is exposing people, how people are accessing news through social media, whether it's exposing people to news and whether that's happening incidentally or as a deliberate choice. So here, just looking at some Asia-Pacific markets compared to the US and the UK. So let's start on the right with the US and the UK. And what we see here is we see that the light blue bar, most people in the US and the UK see news when they're on Facebook, but they're on Facebook for other reasons. So there's incidental exposure, if you like. And as you move to the left of the chart, you see there's only really one country or two countries really where people are more likely or just as likely to go to Facebook as a way of getting news as they are to see news incidentally. And Hong Kong on the far left there, you see people, a majority of people there see Facebook as a useful way of getting news. Singapore, 48%, 47%, pretty similar. So this question about whether Facebook is seen as a route to news or incidental exposure, that news is something they come across incidentally, is interesting. Korea here, well, we've heard, I mean, Facebook is much less important in Korea than most other places, and so if people want news, they'd be using other sources here in Korea. I guess this feeds in across all our countries to the kind of critical question about what's happening on social media and news, and whether social media and search are creating echo chambers where people only see news that reinforces their views, or whether it's exposing them to more sources. And the work we've done this year, when we count the number of sources that people use each week, suggests that people using search and social media and news aggregators tend to use more sources of news every week and a greater diversity of sources than those that don't. So this challenges the idea that people using social media are entirely living within an echo chamber. We're looking at the number of sources of news they're looking at each week here. We're not tracking the stories they're looking at. So they could be looking at multiple sources on the same story, but on the face of it, it looks as if distributed media is creating a more varied media diet than people who are not using social or search. That's what's happening if people look at social media. So social media is a really good way of seeing a range of different sources, and so is search. But there's a real problem for news organizations. And this slide here is based on some work that we did that was based on some passive tracking just in the UK of people using social media and search for news as opposed to people who went direct to the brand. So you can see the figures here. 81% of people who went direct to the brand, when we asked them within 24 hours, do you remember what you looked at 24 hours ago and where it came from? 81% of people remembered the brand that produced the story. If you look at the figures for search and social, less than half. 37% who came via search, 47% who came via social. This was an interesting study. It's available on the Reuters Institute website. It's called I Saw the News on Facebook, and it's available as a free download. And this is just one headline slide from it. One interesting thing about these findings is that on the one hand, they look a little pessimistic if you're a news organization that wants to extend your reach and for people to remember where they saw the news from. But the longer study also shows there are some differences between different organizations as to their success in branding their content and search and social in particular, and making sure that people remembered them well. So some media organizations in the UK, The Guardian, did better than many others in the way it branded its content, so people remembered where it came from, however they got to the content. I just want to move on to the question of paying for news. So we heard a bit about this yesterday, that there's evidence of the Trump bump in the US in terms of more people paying for news this year, 2017, than last year. Last year, our figures showed 9% of US people had paid for news. This year, that has increased by 7%. It's not just more people paying for news. There's also been, and we heard a bit about this yesterday, there's been a growth in the number of people subscribing to some of the main US news organizations. So the figure here for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the New Yorker, increase in number of subscriptions to each of these news organizations. The figures here are that we're giving are from November for the first half of 2017. Excuse me. So some growth in the US, but very little change elsewhere. The overall figure across our 36 countries is 13% of people paying for online news across our countries. The figures tend to be highest in Norway, 26%, and pretty high in Northern Europe, where there's high levels of education, a long tradition of reading, and countries that have been relatively well insulated by language from international news providers. Lowest in the UK, 6%. Obviously, the English language means the UK is very open to a whole range of news provision from a lot of different providers. So in terms of paying for news, 13% overall, but some big variations between countries. And here's a quote from somebody, while news is free, I'd happily not pay for it. But if there was a concerted effort to get me to pay, I think I might pay happily. Just looking again at countries here in the Asia-Pacific region, and just distilling some of the figures from all our 36 countries here, you see again the UK on the right-hand side, 6% paying for news in the last year, US 16%, and quite a variation here, the highest figure being in Hong Kong and Malaysia, and a relatively low figure, 12% in Korea, South Korea, just below the average of 13% overall. So this year we did something slightly different from what we've ever done before, which is we looked at how payment for news compared to payment for other things online. Because, you know, there used to be a view that nobody would pay for anything online, but you only need to think of number of people paying for Netflix, Spotify, music online, films online, and so on, to realize that's just not true. There's lots of payments for other things. And what we did is we tried to map these three different kinds of payment this year, and on this chart they're mapped by age. So the first thing that you see that's quite interesting here is the people who are most likely to pay tend to be the youngest people. So the idea that nobody pays for anything online and young people certainly don't pay for anything online is clearly just wrong. There's a lot of digital payments going on here, and they're all skewed towards the left-hand side of the chart, with the peak period being 25 to 34. So, people will pay for digital media. The question is, what's the relationship between paying for news and paying for other things? And we can see a relationship here between these lines. There's a greater propensity to pay for news amongst older people, but there's also some kind of linkage between people who are paying for news, paying for some things on digital, and people who will pay for other things. This is just one US interviewee that we talked to in this category of 25 to 34, paying for multiple things. The New York Times, he's reading The Guardian, he's looking at The Intercept, he's paying for a range of things there. And what we're finding is that this age group, 25 to 34, is an age group that is worth targeting and are not averse to paying for things. I guess there's a difference, though, between news and some of these other things. When you pay for news, you tend to subscribe, in most countries, to one news organization. When you subscribe to Netflix or Spotify, you're buying a catalog. You're buying a whole range of different services. So I think there's an interesting question there for news organizations as to how they deal with that difference. So just to recap, I said at the beginning, trust is low. It's lowest in social media, but it's also it's higher in news media. But that trust in news media is complicated by polarization. But news media is valued more than social media in separating fact from fiction. There's probably an opportunity for news organizations to build on that trust, to create valuable experiences that people will return to again and again. Social media is still absolutely critical for news, but we're seeing a shift to some more private messaging apps. And as we've seen, a whole range of platforms are really important in exposing more people to news. But there's a real issue about brand recognition when people read the news through those different platforms. Paying for news is an interesting one. It can be built on utility. This news is useful to me. It can be built on trust. This news is trustworthy. It can be built on affinity. I think that's what we're seeing in the US at the moment, and in the Trump bump, reactions to what's going on in US politics, more subscriptions to certain newspapers in the US. Or it can be built, as my last point I've just made, on prior experience of digital payments. People have paid for other things in digital, so people think it's logical to pay for news as well. So how one works around if you like, the call to action in terms of why people might pay for news, I think it's useful for news organizations to think about where they sit between those four different categories at the bottom, and whether they can do anything about ensuring that news gives you a package, not just an individual experience. So, thank you. I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.
네, 고생 많으셨습니다. 지금 질문이 또 여러 개가 올라왔는데요. 한 질문에 여러 개가 담겨 있는 경우도 있어서 미리 좀 양해를 구하고 질문을 시작해 보도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 질문은 캄보디아에서 오신 분이 해주셨어요. It is a great chance for me to know the research findings about digital media 2017. Through your findings, what are the best practices to ensure the trusted news? How can we implement it?
I think, well, this is clearly, excuse my voice, it's clearly a complicated issue. I think there's really sort of two approaches, I'd say, to ensuring that people have trust in your news. The other is not trying to pursue a very partisan agenda, so trying to tell the news the way you find it, try and make sense of the news, but without orientating your news necessarily to support one particular political perspective. But the other thing is, since all of us have some kind of perspective in what we do, is to be open about your sources and to be transparent about the processes for gathering your news. So I think some combination of the two together are useful in inducing trust. But we also need to know that many societies are becoming more polarized. So even if you do both, you won't be trusted by everybody. the degree to which you're trusted by everybody will depend on the degree of polarization in your society. But you can try and do both of those, I think. Try to be as honest as you can and as non-partisan as you can, but also to be open about your own prejudices and your own processes and the way you went about telling the story.
네, 그 같이 있는 두 번째 질문도 사실은 맥을 같이 하는 질문 같기는 하지만 조금 더 구체적이기 때문에 그러면 구체적인 소셜 미디어의 예를 들어서 혹시 한번 설명해 주실 수 있는지 여쭙겠습니다. 페이스북 같은 소셜 미디어의 경우에는 그러면 사용자가 어떻게 페이크 뉴스랑 트러스티드 뉴스를 구별할 수 있는지 혹시 좀 더 구체적으로 말씀해 주실 수 있으실까요?
I'm not sure I'm necessarily the right person to do that. I think there's other people speaking this morning. I'm looking at Dan Gilmore over there, who I think may be talking a little bit more about those things. Obviously, there's various verification exercises around, and we heard about some of those yesterday. In terms of fact-checking and other things, and so there are signals of various kinds to indicate whether news has been verified by third parties. But I'm not particularly an expert in telling you more than that. And I think this session that's going to go on all this morning, I think there'll be a whole range of ideas that will emerge, which may help give the answer to that and may give you a better answer than I would do.
네, 그럼 첫 번째 질문 중에 이번에 또 다음 질문 이어가겠습니다. 소셜 미디어가 어떻게 변화하고 있는지를 설명을 해주셨는데요. 뉴스 미디어의 관점에서 본다면 그러면 소셜 미디어에 대한 생각 또는 정의는 어떻게 하고 계시나요?
We've got a very demanding audience here wanting really difficult answers early in the morning. But I suppose in terms of social media, I think for me, social media is a great way of getting alerted to a huge range of things that are going on. The problem is that the rate at which things spread on social is not necessarily related to the quality of the news or the integrity of the story or indeed the veracity of the story. So there's a tension, if you like, between social strength, which is notification system, sharing and speed of transmission, and the strength of news, which is, one would hope, honesty, truth, and veracity. So there's a tension between these two, and I suppose what I've described this morning is some of the ways in which social can help news organizations get their message out there. But at the same time, clearly one wants, if you're a news organization, you want to get your message out there, you want them to know where it came from, and you would like to think that news that is true gets shared more frequently than news that is false. So, as I say, there's lots of benefits in social for news organizations, but there's also some risks, both for news organizations in terms of brand recognition and also for society in terms of the quality of the news that's spread.